Welcome to the guide, Exile. I've got another build that I felt like making a video guide for, as it's been performing above my expectations. This build is effectively an avoid all damage taken Warden, that I refer to as the wacky warding Warden. It makes use of many different defensive options to completely avoid or negate damage while leveraging the power of the new Warden Ascendancy to provide the offensive power. With the Settlers of Kalgura patch, we got a whole new swath of skills, items, ascendancies, and general balance changes to play with. The biggest of which were Warcry-based slammers. And due to that, I started the league with an auto-exertion berserker that did great damage, but was also really good at getting killed or killing itself. So after running that build to its death over and over in high-tier maps, I wanted something that was a bit more tanky and could do tier 17s with. So I swapped over to a retaliation-based gladiator that was much more reliable due to the block aspect, but just wasn't that reliable, as a gladiator requires you to have blocked recently to have the busted lucky block, and the whole clunk of waiting to get hit before you could hit the enemy, which we all know is not the best strategy in Path of Exile. So for this third build, I figured I would get it right and get some damage and some overpowered defenses to balance it all out, and not have to worry about nearly any enemies in the game. So let's talk about some defenses of the build. In this league, we get access to the new Svalinn shield, which many of you may know by now. It is incredibly powerful. It provides both attack and spell block, triggers socketed elemental spells, along with a negative to our max block chances, but that's easily cancelled out by the most important line, chance to block is lucky. That means whenever we block, our chance is rolled twice, giving us a 90% effective attack and spell block chance when we're capped out. Another thing this shield gives us is Ward, a mechanic that was introduced in 3.15 but has been largely ignored since due to lack of ways to scale and integrate it. This patch, Ward got some quality of life updates along with some really strong unique gear to make it a viable defense option. Ward works like a one-off shield for hits. If it takes any amount of damage from a hit, it will mitigate up to its value and the remainder of the hit will go to your other life resources. In this case, it just goes straight to our life. Once Ward is down, it takes 2 seconds to come back up, regardless if you take damage during that time, and it recovers all of itself instantly. Ward also only protects against hits, so damage over time will just go straight past it. So ideally, we want to ensure that we're not getting hit such that we would take damage to our life to maximize our ward uptime for hits that actually matter. This of course pairs nicely with the shield. As we have such high effective block, we reduce the amount of hits that actually incur damage. To push this further, I stacked evasion and spell dodge into the build to add another layer of attack and spell avoidance on top of the block. This makes it such that almost all hits never really go through our avoidance layers, and make our ward extremely effective without any other investments into its recovery. To scale our ward to higher values, I made use of the new Ynda's belt that takes a percentage of your body armor's armor and evasion and adds it as ward instead. This belt alone basically doubles our health pool from hits, and we can almost always rely on it being up. And finally, or first I guess, is the Warden's ability to freeze, and at the very least chill, almost every enemy in the game. I frequently freeze tier 17 map bosses and almost any enemy below that level, so they never really get the chance to even take a swing at me. Speaking of freezing enemies, what are we doing on the offensive side? Well, for this I was a bit more unsure. We do have to make a lot of investments into our main defensive layers, leaving very little for the offensive side. Luckily, the new Warden Ascendancy is very powerful, mainly in the way of tinctures and ailments. Tinctures basically carry all of our power with the Warden Ascendancy, and we're able to keep them up all the time. Along with that, we also get the Unbound skill that gives a huge DPS burst and boosts up our damage on single harder targets. Now, as for the skill of choice to deliver all this damage, I felt obligated on going with a projectile-based melee skill due to the nodes I have to take in the region of the tree that we're in. I use Lightning Strike for general clear and minor bossing, and swap to Molten Strike for more serious bosses such as tier 17s and any endgame bosses that you would be doing, as it has better single target potential, as well as many projectile hits for recovery and some abuse of some mechanics. Realistically, you can use any melee strike skill that doesn't require splash, and that can be used with a dagger, such as Frostblades. It really comes down to personal preference, as the offensive portion of the build is just an elemental stacking crit-based dagger warden. So putting all this together with some good recovery, we're able to face tank almost every move in the game that is hit-based while still doing some solid damage. Damage over time is still somewhat of an issue, but we do almost get all ailment immunity, and we really only have to worry about actual moves that we would stand in and that we would generally have enough time to react to and get out of. Overall, this build has been a blast to play, and once I got the gear on it going, I had to go out of my way to die. It makes taking on busted tier 17s and overtuned Eldritch Altar content a breeze. Basically, the only mods I have to avoid on tier 17s are the ones that straight up remove block, and everything else is runnable. So let's take a look at how I put the character together. So for the Ascendancy, we are of course going with the Warden. This is the new Ascendancy on the Ranger that replaces the Raider. But what it does have now is a new set of nodes that work with tinctures, which were introduced in Affliction League, and these make the tinctures really strong. So with a few nodes in the tree, along with some mana recovery, we can keep tinctures up pretty much all the time, being that they will only be down for around 6 seconds with the cooldown recovery, which is of course how long we can keep the lingering effect for. And then on top of that, we can also have another tincture, so we can have two very, very powerful flasks effectively up all the time that give us a massive amount of damage. On the defensive side / utility side, we have the ability to effectively freeze almost any enemy in the game as long as we can deal enough damage. And with the build we have pretty much enough damage to freeze or chill any boss that's tier 17 and below, making this a very nice node for a defensive application. And then finally we have the Unbound Avatar skill, which since we are applying many different elemental ailments, we are stacking up the Unbound Fury quite quickly. We are pretty much at the cap of the cooldown on it. So once we get this up, it's a massive 10-second, 80% more elemental damage, and it is great to use basically whenever it's up. And again, I just can't understate how much damage the tinctures bring to the build and really makes this work. So here's an overview of the entire passive tree. We are generally staying on the right side of the tree, along with a little bit of venturing into the duelist area. And the biggest focus of this tree is to try to sort out all of the defensive applications while also getting some good offenses going through the areas. So looking at the Keystones, the major one we're getting is Acrobatics. This Keystone has gone through a bunch of changes over the years and really has fallen out of favor due to spell suppression being so strong on its own. To trade it for a dodge is pretty iffy, but in our scenario, we want to try to layer those avoidance layers. So for us, Acrobatics is very strong, and due to our tree, our gear, and some of our setup, we have a lot of extra spell suppression, making this node very easy to hit cap and providing a lot of avoidance. The other keystone we take in the tree is Point Blank. Again, for 1 point, since we're scaling melee projectile attacks, this gives a lot more damage, especially when using Molten Strike. Many of those projectiles will benefit from this Point Blank and just effectively gives us 30% more damage for a point. Now this keystone is a bit different, is not used on too many builds, but ultimately Nature's Patience gives us 20% chance to deal double damage, while also a 10% less multiplier to damage taken. Now, Grasping Vines, as you may have experienced in rituals or from some rare monsters, effectively slows your character's movement speed. However, it does not affect your attack speed or your ability to use a movement skill. In our scenario, we're using Whirling Blades, and that scales solely off of attack speed, and you can zip around a map no problem with a bunch of Grasping Vines on you. It just becomes a bit more apparent when you try to walk. Though for all of the defenses we have, it really isn't too much of an issue that we're a bit slower on the initial move, since we can Whirling Blades out of everything. It really just comes down to a preference of playstyle. If you really don't enjoy dealing with the vines, you could drop this jewel. I solely take it because it's a lot of extra damage, also giving us a pretty good amount of defensiveness. And since I'm pretty much just standing still right-clicking on targets, I figured why not. Alright, as for Masteries, I did choose to go with Daggers on this build over Claws, and that was actually for 3 reasons. Daggers have a mastery that allows us to gain a bit more spell suppression, letting us get to our Acrobatics cap. Daggers also have a block implicit that helps us cap our block, and Daggers can craft the Fortify on hit with the rune crafting table this league. We also take the Mark Mastery to gain frenzy charges on marked enemies. This helps us maintain frenzy charges on unique enemies and bosses. The Evasion Mastery we take is the Suppression one, again helps us fill out our suppression to cap our spell dodge. Our Attack Mastery is the additional target of strikes. This helps our clearing and helps us target more enemies to create more projectiles. We take this mana mastery down here to get the reservation efficiency, so we can stack more auras. Our tincture mastery is the first 6 mana burns applied have no effect. This really helps the uptime on our tinctures, allowing us to get more stacks to really max out our lingering effect from the Warden. Our elemental mastery is the 25% chance to treat enemy elemental resistances as inverted. This is very powerful as we really don't make use of any penetration other than our tincture, as well as we don't apply any curses or exposures to reduce elemental resistances. So when you're running maps that have a lot of elemental resistances, the damage will be a bit more spiky, but it'll help average that out. And finally, we take the block mastery that grants us spell damage block per 5 chance to block attack damage. This allows us to really help fill out our spell block on the build. As for jewels, we do the following. We take a Thread of Hope with a massive ring. This allows us to get a lot of nice nodes in the Ranger start and the Shadow start. As you can see, we pick up Quick Step, Weapon Artistry, Aspect of the Lynx, Forces of Nature, Perfectionist, Sleight of Hand, Blood Siphon, and Hired Killer. These are all really strong nodes, but generally pathing to them is very expensive, and usually the nodes leading up to them aren't as powerful. So I chose to use the Light of Meaning Prismatic Jewel in this jewel socket. Just as mentioned before, we're taking a lot of the notables through this massive ring, which also overlap with this jewel, and we're also taking a lot of nodes generically within this area just due to their power. So I chose to use the one that gives chaos resistance. This effectively allows us to ignore chaos resistance on any of our gear pieces, allowing us to free up a suffix spot, and almost caps us out on chaos resistance. It brings us into the 60s, and we can fill it out with just a little bit more investment, either in a jewel or implicits. The other reason I chose to use the Light of Meaning here is because if we were to use any Timeless Jewel, that would change acrobatics to be a different keystone, effectively voiding the use of acrobatics on the build. And I did not really have another good spot to put a Timeless Jewel in this build, just due to the way the points laid out. We're also using an Impossible Escape around Blood Magic. As over by Blood Magic, we can get the +3 to maximum chance to block attack damage. That brings our maximum block chance from 65 to 68. And then once we get the lucky, that is where we bring us up to the 90% effective. We're also able to get 1 Rage on melee hit node. This is huge, as Rage this league has been adjusted to give more attack damage rather than increased attack damage. So on bosses and mobs that were generally melee hitting enough, we'll be at 30 Rage the entire time for another 30% more damage. Again, as mentioned before, we're using Natural Affinity. I got this one with Corrupted Blood Can't Be Inflicted on me, as it is pretty much the cheapest jewel I can get that has this on it. And again, this jewel isn't required. Some people may or may not like the playstyle with the Grasping Vines on a non-Juggernaut style build, but I for one don't mind it, and it feeds into the sit there and right click build style. I chose to use a Watcher's Eye that had suppression while affected by Grace. This helped remove another suffix slot on gear to help cap out our acrobatics, and I was able to find one with a gain life on hit with Vitality. This combo isn't necessarily required. If you can find it, that's great, but basically you can look for any of the bonuses in a Watcher's Eye that would be helpful for your gearing scenario. And really the life gain on hit is most useful, again, if you are using Molten Strike. Most other skills that are really only hitting at your attack rate aren't going to be as strong, but anything that has multiple hits per attack, again, such as Molten Strike, is going to give you the best bang for buck on a life gain on hit setup. This also sort of helps make up for the fact that we're not using claws due to the aforementioned reasons that we went for daggers, and helps balance out our recovery rate. I'm also choosing to use Ancestral Vision. This will also effectively give us 75% chance to avoid elemental ailments, because we do have to get to 150% chance to suppress to max out acrobatics. This means that between this node set right here, and then just 1 implicit on boots, you're able to have full elemental ailment avoidance at no real aggressive investment that's outside of the things we already wanted to get. And then I'm also using an Abyss Jewel, which is great for added flat damage, which is just very good damage on this build, but also because we want fire damage from somewhere, that will allow us to apply ignites. And really, for whatever gearing scenario you're set up in, try to get whatever flat damages you don't have elsewhere, because we want to try to apply all the ailments, and that means we need a source of every type of damage to apply those. So again, in my instance, I didn't have fire damage anywhere else on my gear or on my weapon, so I got it through this jewel, allowing me to apply ignites for our yoke. And then finally we have our cluster jewels. You want to get prodigious defense, which gives the block chance, and then the other one you'll want feed the fury and fuel the fight. Those will give us our attack damage leech and our mana damage leech, along with some extra attack speed and damage while leeching, which is most all the time. Again, the block chance on the other node. The final node is just one of the suffixes. It can be any of the suffixes that can occur on these. There's 3 different ones. As long as the 2 nodes that you want are in the front, that's all that matters, because we don't take the back node. And finally, for the travel nodes, we put on some tattoos. So the main ones we'll want to get is a blind on hit. This helps scale our evasion further. And then we're going to want 5 chance to avoid being stunned. Those tattoos paired with Perfectionist, along with some other stun avoidance we have, brings us to 100% chance to avoid stuns, so we will never be stunned. We do not have to worry about stun and block recovery or anything like that. The third tattoo we'll want to get for sure is a chance to poison on hit. Again, I haven't talked about it yet, but we are using a yoke, so applying all of our ailments is important. And then finally, I just put a bunch of evasion rating tattoos to fill out the rest of our dex nodes that we didn't need for any gear attribute requirements. But you could put any other dex tattoo on here you want to either fill out suppression or cold resistance or any of the other ones that are optional on dex nodes. I just had all of those other things capped, so putting evasion rating on was the next best thing. So overall, this pastor tree worked out really well. There's a lot going on in it, and I think pretty much every node on it is the most effective it can be, and really works out to get all the things we want. As for Pantheons, I'm using Soul of Arakali. Since we're ailment immune, we don't have to use Brine King, and this helps out a lot using Arakali because it's another damage over time reduction, and also gives us good recovery if we just get out of a damage over time. And even though we are pretty much capped on Chaos Res, it does help fill out Chaos Resistance for damage over time modifiers, maybe before you get to that point. As for the Miner, this generally will change up depending on the map you're doing. If you have Burning Ground, or Searing Exarch mobs, or you need life pots or something along those lines. But in general, I use Soul of Shikari for the reduction of poison duration, as well as a cap on the number of poisons on us to help reduce our damage over time taken. And again, the secondary of this is a generic reduced damage taken, so that helps for both hits and damage over time. But again, Pantheons are situational, use whichever you'd like, but I found these to be the better of them for our situation. Okay, so for the gem links on the build, we'll start out with the main damage dealing skill. Again, I chose to use Lightning Strike for my generic clearing skill. I can pretty much use this on all content except for the endgame stuff if I want more damage, but using this along with Evolve Lightning Strike in maps makes for a really nice clear. You can get to enemies before they get to you, and you can clear stuff off screen. But again, you can use pretty much any skill you want, as we are just generic crit elemental stacking with daggers. Put any skill you want in there that scales with some projectiles, or just scales well without melee splash, and you'll be off to the races. Again, when I'm swapping into Molten Strike, I just used a Omen of Blanching until I got the off colors that work for my supports, which is 2 green, 2 red, and 2 blue. And I just have to swap between a green and a red. So getting any combination that works like that. For my chest here, I got 3 white with a red, green, and a blue, allowing me to easily swap in my Molten Strike if I want. And if I really want, I could swap one of these other supports out for returning projectiles, and it kind of may or may not give more damage. It's tough to tell, but generally I just do a single gem swap and it's fine. The supports on it are elemental damage with attacks, ideally awakened elemental damage. Multi-strike, again, if you can get a awakened multi-strike, that'll be better. We're using awakened added lightning damage support. This does give another level to our lightning strike, so that is extra damage there. But more importantly, the lightning damage is good to help scale our shocks. Nightblade, This is a very strong support as we are granted elusive pretty much all the time. Elusive does make us harder to hit, another good bonus for our build style, and it gives us a bunch of critical strike bonuses, so this is a very good support for this build. And then finally we just have an increased critical damage support, as we are not picking up too much critical damage multiplier from jewel stacking or anything like that. This helps backfill a lot of that and brings us up over 500 crit multi, I believe. For our movement, we're using Whirling Blades as mentioned before. Since this scales totally off of attack speed, the Grasping Vines pretty much play no part, and you can zip around a map with this and almost not lose any of your Grasping Vines if you're not really walking, allowing you to keep that uptime on them and your damage reduction from them. I pair Whirling Blades, of course, with a faster attacks as well as a rage support. As mentioned in the passive tree, we are gaining rage on melee hit, but this also grants us rage when we're just whirling through enemies, helping stack our rage up higher, and it also gives us some attack speed while we're above 10 rage, which is generally all the time, making our Whirling Blades even faster. And then finally, I just have a dash in here. For auras, we're running Herald of Ice. This is nice for the shatters, the pops, the clearing, and gives us a bit more flat damage. Tempest Shield. This is, of course, required for the chance to block spell damage. Running a Grace with the Vol variant as well. Again, mainly for boosting our evasion rating as much as possible, and the Vol Grace helps out on those scenarios where you might feel like you're going to get hit. You pop that, you gain a whole bunch of extra evasion. And then finally, Vitality. Vitality is nice both for its passive regen, since we really don't get much on this side of the tree, and for its pairing with the Watcher's Eye, which there are a bunch of other mods. There are increased recovery rate, generic leech, and other combinations you can get, but I found that the life gain on hit was the best for my setup, especially using Molten Strike. But if you really don't want to use Vitality, you can also fit in some more mana reservation. You could put in an Anger or a Wrath and get a double jewel with that, and just live with a bit of degen, but I preferred to have positive regen. For our defensive side, we are putting in a Steel Skin, and we're running this with an automation. This will effectively cast Steel Skin every time it's off cooldown, and we're pairing that with a more duration so it stays up a little bit longer. And Steel Skin's nice because since we're not scaling armor, it's going to give us a flat reduction to the damage we're taking every time it's up, and we don't have to worry about getting a bunch of armor to make that flat reduction very valuable. And it also has the line of immunity to bleeding, so every time it's coming up, it's just going to strip a bleed off of us, so we're effectively immune to bleeding as long as we're not moving really fast when we catch a bleed. And then finally I have a Blood Rage in here on automation, so it's always up. This allows us to generate our frenzy charges while mapping, and it keeps it up while we're bossing for the attack speed, which we lack in this build, so having any attack speed is really strong. Then we have a Sniper's Mark with a mark on hit life tap setup. This gives us a lot of damage on our single targets because we're using projectiles, and pretty much beats out any other mark. You could also use an Assassin's Mark if you aren't going to go with projectiles, but we basically get capped crit, and Assassin's Mark becomes quite underpowered compared to Sniper's Mark in our setup anyway. And then finally in this Svalinn, we trigger elemental spells on block, so we like to put a couple useful ones in here. I have a Flame Wall. This effectively gives us more flat fire damage to our lightning strikes. Not quite sure if this works with Molten Strike, but either way, it's useful for lightning strike. We have a Sigil of Power. This gives us flat lightning damage to any of our attacks as long as we're standing in the circle where it's put down. And then finally we have a Purifying Flame, which throws down a consecrated ground on the enemy, basically just giving us more regen. There could be other setups in here that are better to put. Maybe there's supports to put on these, but I kind of found it just nice to have these 3 different spells coming up when we're fighting something to give us some more damage and some more recovery. Alright, going through the gear, we'll start with the weapon. So as mentioned before, I chose to go with daggers. This was for a couple of reasons. The main ones being that it gives us an implicit chance to block attack damage, helping us fill out some more block without having to spend passive points on it, as well as having the rune crafting melee hits fortify, which is only available on daggers, not claws. This gives us, again, more defensive layers, and I just wanted to stack defensive layers. And then, of course, the Masteries on the dagger were quite nice. Even though we didn't pick up the elusive effect wheel, just having the extra suppression was great for our acrobatics. So, crafting this weapon, I basically just spammed it with any of the flat damage elemental essences. Of course, this is a tier 1 fractured attack speed that basically allowed me to get at least 2 good flat elemental damage rolls. This one I got lucky. I hit a tier 1 cold damage with the Deafening Wrath essence and had an open prefix. That allowed me to craft prefixes can't be changed. And then once I crafted that on, I just crafted on the harvest bench, reforging with critical modifiers until I hit a good critical modifier on the suffix. I ended up hitting tier 1 increased crit strike chance on the 3rd try, and then I slammed it and got cold resistance, so I just had to live with that. And then I just crafted hits can't be evaded in the prefix slot that was open, so we don't have to worry about accuracy. And with this weapon, basically crit cap, it would have been nice to get another modifier on the suffix that was strong, but I'll take the cold res as I'm running Eater altars, and having extra cold res is nice since I take all the minus lightning and cold res altars anyway. And then for all the rest of the armor pieces, we're going to be looking to get armor evasion hybrids for both the suppression and the stat bonuses that we can get from them. So for the helmet, ideally what we're looking for is life. We're going to have to fill out intelligence and suppression, and anything else we can get on top of that is good. So getting another res there, getting extra armor evasion is great. But ideally the big things is intelligence, life, and suppression. As for the Eldritch Implicits, the reduced mana cost for attacks is very important in this league, as melee skills got a huge bump in mana cost. And then the mana reservation of skills is required to fit in all of our auras. For the gloves, much like the helmet, we really want to target getting strength, life, and suppression, and anything we get on top of that is great. I found one with some flat lightning damage to attacks, which is useful for our build, and then resistance, and it has okay armor evasion rating, but that's kind of the last thing we want to worry about. For the Eldritch Implicits, we went with Projectiles Pierce an additional target. This is for Lightning Strike, doesn't really do anything for Molten Strike, but improves the mapping. And then skills target 1 additional nearby enemy. You could Orb of Conflict this up to 2 additional enemies, but I found having the node in the tree and having this on the gloves was plenty. But of course, if you do Eldritch this up to 2, you could get rid of that mastery and reallocate those points elsewhere. As for the boots, much like the gloves, we want to get life, suppression, strength, and then movement speed. I managed to find these with very high movement speed and a good resistance as well. As for the Eldritch Implicits, we went with the Avoid Elemental Ailments. As I mentioned during the passive tree, we can pretty much cap out our elemental ailments with just the lower version of this on the implicit. And then the other one I chose was Chaos Resistance, as we are lacking that by about 15 total. So getting this plus the Jewel capped me on Chaos Resistance. So for the chest piece, we want to use a Conquest Lamelar. Totally didn't pronounce that right, but this is important as the belt we are using, the Ynda stand, converts 60% of armor and evasion rating into ward. So using a base such as this one, we get a lot of armor and evasion rating, and just from this base alone, we are pretty much getting 4,000 ward. So for this chest that I have on, I just took dense fossils and crafted the chest until I hit very high armor evasion rating, and it just so happened, again, kind of like the weapon, I ended up hitting tier 1, tier 1, tier 2, and then I just crafted prefixes can't be changed, harvest crafted physical modifiers until I got the tier 1 physical damage reduction. Then I crafted spell suppression and slammed it and got a terrible strength roll on it. Again, if I want to re-roll this one, I can. It's not bricked. However, I felt this was plenty. Since we get so much life on all of our other gear pieces, and in general we have a pretty good percentage life from the tree, forgoing life on the chest isn't such a downside, as even without that and not even taking the life mastery, I'm still at over 4,200 HP. With the amount of defenses we have, it's just a ridiculous amount of EHP. So I was fine not worrying about life on this and just going pure defenses. As for the Eldritch Implicits, The chance to block attack damage helps fill out that last little bit of block we're missing without spending passive points. And then I just went for an offensive modifier, critical strike multiplier for attack damage. Of course, again, as with all these gear pieces, pick and choose which modifiers you may or may not need based on your gearing scenario. Now, to speak to the belt again, we are using this belt to gain all of the ward. And an important note to this belt, you can use the defense modifier catalyst to improve the 50% to a 60% gain, effectively just giving you 10% more ward. For the amulet, we're using a Yoke of Suffering. This, since we're applying so many elemental ailments, and we can get all the rest of them pretty easily, we can get a whole bunch of extra increased damage taken on the enemies. Enemies take increased damage, acts as a multiplier against all of your existing multipliers rather than being additive. However, all sources of enemies take increased damage are additive, so this amulet, for example, if we apply Shock, Ignite, and Chill, that'll be 30% increased damage taken rather than 10 times 10 times 10. So, looking at that, and then looking at Sniper's Mark, enemies take increased damage from this, that gets added with it. So, once you start adding a bunch of these increased damage takens, they do lose their value, but if you can get a couple good big sources of it, it is one big multiplier against all of your damage. So with our build, we are applying Chill, Ignite, Freeze, Bleed, and Poison, and that gives us a whole bunch of damage right there. So this is a very strong amulet, and can't be understated how useful it is in this style of build. As for the Anoint, we go with Safeguard, and this is to get the +3 to our maximum spell block chance. So like our attack block, these are both at 68, 68, and then when they're lucky, they are 90, 90. As for the rings, ultimately these are just to fill out our missing stats, life, and resistances. And if you can get any kind of positive attack bonuses on them, that's great. I ended up finding some rings that had open prefixes, where I put non-channeling skills can have minus cost to their mana, as well as slamming a Redeemer Orb on it for the projectile attack damage. If you're lucky, you might also get the flat cold damage or cold damage with frenzies. It ended up being that both of the rings that I rolled were basically the same. I got the projectile attack damage on both of them, and then just non-channeling skills have minus mana cost, and our skill still costs 11 mana, even with those two rings and the helmet. So it is still pretty expensive, so you definitely will need to get at least one minus mana cost, I believe, in order to have good maintenance of the skill with your tinctures. And then finally we have the Svalinn shield. As mentioned in the introduction, this shield is busted and really nice. It effectively just gives us a gladiator at home on a shield. And the best part about it is your chances to block is always lucky. You don't need to have blocked recently, so you can run around avoiding moves and then stand still and still have good block, unlike the Gladiator. And this shield also gives us some utility, being able to auto-cast some elemental skills that give us some more damage and defense. So for the Flasks on this build, due to the way the League mechanic works right now, I've been using a gold flask to get as much gold out of maps as possible. However, when I'm doing actual bosses or I'm doing some content that I think is more dangerous, I will use an iron flask. Iron flasks are almost never used in any builds because they're ward related, but what you can do is put a savage hit craft on these, and then basically whenever you take a hit that's big enough that's going to rip away your ward and your HP, the flask will trigger and it'll restore all your ward instantly, which will effectively bring your total HP right back up to where it was before after you get a little bit of recovery with Life Leech. So rolling all of our flasks with chance to gain charge when you deal a crit is very powerful because we are critting almost every hit as we are maxed out when our tinctures are up. And speaking of tinctures, the main tinctures we are using are the increased critical strike chance with melee weapons and elemental damage with melee weapons. Now these implicits are variable, so you can Blessed Orb them up. For example, on this one I'm 148 out of 150. And the mods we want to try to get on these are increased effect with mana burn rate, as well as melee weapon attack speed and melee weapon damage penetration. Getting both of these mods on tier 1 makes them very strong, and as mentioned before when we were talking about the tincture nodes in the tree, the first 6 applications don't apply to the burn, so getting these with the increased burn rate isn't too bad, as we have pretty good leech, reduced cost of the skill, and a free 6 burns to begin with, so we are pretty much always getting the maximum linger effect, even though we have increased mana burn rate. And the effect modifier is so strong that you just want that because of how much damage these things give when you press them. For the final flasks, I'm just using a silver flask because I didn't have another good way of getting onslaught that didn't require a bunch of passive points or some weird gear setup. Reduced effect of curses, since we are immune to all elemental ailments, bleed, corrupting blood, and we reduce poison so much. The effective suffixes on flasks are somewhat limited, but the reduced effect of curses is nice, so if you're running curse maps, they are pretty much negated. And then finally, we're using a Jade Flask for the evasion rating, rolled with flash charge when you deal a critical strike, and increased evasion rating on the suffix. Now, as you'll notice, I'm not using a life flask, and that is largely because I haven't felt I need one. I did have one for quite some time, but I really was never pressing it, and when I would press it, it was pretty much unnecessary. So once I got corrupting blood immunity and sorted that out, I pretty much dropped. I just dropped a life flask, and I have not died in any scenario where I would have been saved by a life flask. It's pretty much just been deaths from really, really unlucky one-shots, or just standing in some hyper degen that a life flask wouldn't have saved me from anyways. So getting that extra utility, since we are using 2 tinctures, is nice to have the at least 3 utility flasks up. And of course, you can play with whatever flask you like, whatever makes sense for you, but this is kind of what I found what works best on my iteration of the build. Alright, as for leveling this build, I kind of just went with the default leveling gimmick of the league, which is using Envy with the Summon Spectral Wolves. This carried me to about Act 8, and then it starts to fall off. Basically what you want to do is craft level 1 Envy and Summon Spectral Wolves on a low item level pair of weapons that you can use while leveling. I just chose these glass shanks because of what the vendor had, and then later on in the leveling process, I ended up swapping to these axes just because I was using some axe nodes while leveling, and you just hit these around level 45 with a Screaming Essence of Fear to gain the minions deal increased damage, and then if you have an open suffix, you can craft the attack and cast speed on there to help improve them. And in the weapon that you have the Summon Spectral Wolf, you'll want to put in minion speed, faster attacks, and minion damage. Ideally, when you get to level 50, you'll want to be using a Hateful Accuser. This gives you more enemies to kill while you're killing bosses to keep your wolves up. But until then, you can use some he-ups and any other unique items that'll help you. I found a Sacrificial Heart to be really nice. I also put Slaughter on it. This gives us rage on hit with axes, such as why I swapped to axes. And pairing those two together with the Admiral's Arrogance, you get your maximum rage quite often while you're leveling to give you extra damage bonus. And the main skill that I used while I was leveling was just Frostblades linked with whatever made the most sense at the time. And I threw in a Thrill Steel for permanent onslaught, 7 League Steps for the movement speed, and then filled out whatever else with uniques or rares that helped me level. And then once I got into the 60s, I just bought some generic cheap gear. You know, I probably spent maybe a divine total on all of this gear here, just to get me through leveling up to the 70s where I could put on the majority of the gear I had crafted. Once you get up to that point, it's pretty much whatever you can get your hands on, whether you're crafting the high tier gear or you're buying it. Ultimately, leveling was quite a breeze all the way up through the end of X. It just got a little awkward in that 60 to 70 range where I was waiting to put on my weapon and the shield and figuring out what skills and stats I was trying to scale the most. Once you get your end game weapon on, so to speak, and the Svalinn shield and the Ynda stand, you pretty much are invulnerable in most maps, and you can have the worst damage ever and still make it through the thing, no problem. But again, it definitely takes some gear, the passive point investment, and the jewels to really get the build fully popping off. So I'd say the build really takes off in the mid 80s and kind of flounders a little bit for the early 60s to 70 area. So don't feel bad if it feels a little off during that leveling phase. It will get better, believe me. So, there it is, a modern day tank in Path of Exile. It's really something I haven't built too much into ever since doing the Doriani's Fist character about a year ago now, since even stacking a bunch of defenses on that character, I was just falling over left and right when I was not getting my moves out early. But with this character, having all those defensive layers in here carries it so hard, along with the fact that we are offensively freezing and stopping many enemies before they get to us, that it just makes it a super comfy play style and very fun to take on against endgame bosses when you know you can just stand there and ignore everything they're doing. So, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, Exile.